businesses in KwaZulu-Natal highlighting the role of criminals taking advantage of a volatile situation amid supposedly pro-Jacob Zuma protests. In almost every demonstration, a predictable pattern follows where public and private property is destroyed and shops are looted. The situation has led to calls for the military to restore some order. What has been the track record of the SAPS in dealing effectively with violent protests, and should government deploy boots on the ground? Joining us now to unpack these issues is criminologist Dr Guy Lamb. He's from Stellenbosch University. I want to just check, if your title professor or doctor? Dr. Lamb, I'm hoping that you were looking at, you were watching the channel just moments ago, those visuals of the Durban CBD being completely looted this morning. I mean, safe to say this is not just a criminal element.
These incidents are deeply concerning, and essentially what we've been seeing is, some protest happening and then some certainly incendiary remarks being made, and certainly the sort of conditions have been created for this kind of violence to take place. So it was encouraged, it was condoned, it was supported. And what's happened, and we've seen it before in South Africa, and certainly we saw it during the 2008 xenophobic violence, we saw it during the 2015 xenophobic violence in Durban, in eThekwini, where we saw large-scale looting taking place as well. I mean, this doesn't come from nothing. And there has been some sort of support for this. It's been condoned. It's been encouraged.
Yeah. I mean, what does it tell you about our intelligence on the ground? Because on the one hand, either our intelligence services didn't know that this was coming, which is incredibly concerning, or the information was there and it chose not to act.
I think the kind of question here is quite difficult when it comes to dealing with looting, because looting can be quite random. I mean, you can have acts where you've got acts of violent protest and there's discussions, and it's, there are going to be hotspots, and the police can almost predict that, and they've got some intelligence for that. But when it comes to the looting that we're seeing at the moment, it's quite difficult, because you're going to have an environment where you've got certain individuals, certain groups that are encouraging looting, encouraging insurrection. I think some of this type of action is actually insurrection, and you're not sure where it's going to take place. So we've seen it, Durban Central Business District. We've seen it in Marion Hill. We've seen it in Lazi. We've seen it all over the place. We've seen it in Gauteng and Alexandra. And so it does make it quite difficult for the police to predict. But I think it's around now. I think they have a better understanding of where things are at. But when you're getting a sporadic violence happening, it does make it quite difficult for the police to respond. But it also does point to maybe more effective ways of proactive thinking around this could have come to being, because Durban CBD has been a hotspot for this kind of violence in the past. So whenever there is, as we saw in 2015, the violence and the looting did take place in the Central Business District. So it kind of does talk to maybe more proactive thinking could have been required.
I mean, in terms of the police's action, particularly in the Durban CBD this morning, as far as we can see, the looting had been taking place throughout the night. In fact, I'm going to take us live to these visuals for just a moment, Dr. Lamb, if you'll stay with us. Karinda Jagmahan is talking to one of the protesters.
Thank you.
All right, you heard there, Dr. Lamb, at least one person who's a part of that protest, linking the protest action to calls for President Jacob Zuma to be let out of prison this morning. The question I was asking you before we went to that was, there were clear signs that the looting had been taking place throughout the night. We were live at one of those positions at 6 o'clock this morning, and our reporter saw several police vans driving past the scene of the looting. What do we make of that?
Well, that was obviously deeply concerning, but I don't think they would have been avoiding that particular looting. They possibly would have been having been directed in order to go to another area. I think in these kind of circumstances that the police can be a bit short-handed in dealing with widespread looting, and they have to go where they are commanded to go. So there may have been an earlier report that they had to attend to where other looting happening. But I think it really does speak to the need for additional capacity to deal with this kind of looting, because as we've seen, it gets out of hand very quickly and it has a contagious element to it. So you have this situation where looting may take place in one particular area, and those who are observing see what's happening and then decide, well, they're getting away with it, we should try it as well. And then it kind of has the sort of cover of kind of objecting to something. I mean, this isn't really protesting that's happening. This is criminality in the name of protesting.
So the police, they've gone some way in improving their public order policing capacity. What does that mean for how quickly these protests can be brought under control?
Well, it is. I mean, they've certainly improved the capacity. So we had before 2012, before the Marikana massacre, we had public order policing, which had been undercapacitated, hadn't really got the resources it required. Certainly after Marikana, there was a lot more investment, a lot more training, increasing the size of the public order policing units. But also the learnings from the Farlam Commission, the Marikana Commission of Inquiry, was that you can't let the highly militarized policing components be part of public order policing, because you often see lives being lost as a result of that. You're often seeing the situation getting out of hand. So public order policing are trained specifically to deal with crowds. And I think the problem we have at the moment is there's not enough public order policing units. That's increased, but in dealing with looting like this, you do need public order policing units. You can handle it. You can ensure that there's not a loss of life. You can ensure that the situation is contained. And of course, they're spread out across the country. And when you have multiple incidents that they need to respond to, they don't have enough manpower to deal with it, as we're seeing certainly in Durban at the moment.
Yeah. So I suppose the question is this morning, will these protests spread to other parts of the country? It's now in Johannesburg, in the CBD, and in Durban. Where to next?
Well, I mean, this is largely linked to objections and opposition to the imprisonment of former President Zuma. So it's supporters that are encouraging it. We've seen those who feel kind of connected to it and feel angry about it. So it's likely to remain within KwaZulu-Natal and parts of sort of inner city of Johannesburg and other sort of township areas where there's support for the former president. We may see it a few other incidences outside of that, for example, within the Free State, where there's certainly some support. But I don't see it being widespread across South Africa. These are going to be concentrated forms of looting. We're going to see the police respond and clamp down. They'll certainly pull in other resources to deal with this. So it's probably not going to lead to places like the Western Cape, places like the Eastern Cape. We may likely see more incidences in Durban, but certainly after a few days, it should hopefully calm down. I
mean, what do we make of the fact that, the places that you have mentioned were the exact same scenes where we saw such incredible violence unfolding in the 90s and more recently, the xenophobic attacks? It's the same areas we're talking about now.
The same areas. I mean, we know with when we look from sort of theory around this kind of collective violence, that places tend to play a role, and it has to do with certain individuals, it has to do with certain groupings, it has to do with the ability to mobilize individuals to deal with it. So if we go back to 2015, we certainly had remarks from the late King Goodwill Zwelithini about anti-foreigner sentiments and sort of encouraging supporters to do something about it, and we saw very quickly violence happening as a result of that. So within the places we're seeing this sort of violence, there seems to be quite well-developed networks and channels that allow for this kind of violence to happen due to certain individuals encouraging it.
I actually wanted to just ask you that question. Who are these individuals who are encouraging it? And of course, outside of the incentive that comes with looting stores like ShopRite and clothing stores like Truworths that we've seen this morning, what's the incentive outside of that?
Well, it's really a display of power. I mean, what we're seeing here is really a demonstration that we can cause violence, we can cause disruption, we can make places ungovernable. And this goes back to strategies of the 1980s, which was a strategy used by liberation movements against the apartheid government very effectively to make townships ungovernable as a demonstration of power, as a demonstration of opposition, as an indication that you have to talk to us, you have to negotiate with us. And that strategy is certainly now being used by elements who are in opposition to what's happened to President Zuma and feeling that he shouldn't be spending any time in jail.
Dr. Guy Lamb, thanks very much for your time this morning. He joins us from Stellenbosch University, and he is a criminologist, as we try to unpack the scenes we're seeing in parts of Johannesburg and particularly in the Durban CBD this morning.